Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Regenstrief Institute Educational Insights and Learning Series. It's my pleasure to introduce Aspen Clemons, the Executive Director of Prosperity Indiana. Prosperity Indiana, for those of you that aren't familiar with this organization, they are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1986. They're a leading advocate for affordable housing and community development. The organization was founded as the Indiana Association for Community Economic Development, and they are a really great network of over 200 organizations and individuals who are really committed to advancing community economic development. So there's a lot of experience and background in education that I have a long bio for Aspen here, but she told me to just get her up here. We want to hear from her. So I'm going to say she has a wealth of experience. And we were just talking about her Spelman College and some of our experiences with Spelman students before this. But without further ado, go ahead and welcome Aspen Clemons. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. All right. Making sure I know where I'm at here. First off, I'd like to thank Joyce and her team for the invitation to join you all today. I met with Joyce back in last fall, to learn about the incredible work that the Institute convenes and the work that you all are focused on. And so we talked a little bit about the direction of this presentation, and my goal is to give you some resources that may be helpful to what you're doing, or to give you some updated information that may be helpful to where you are in your work. All right, today's discussion, I just want to hit on a couple of things. Rachel did a fantastic job of introducing PI and who we are. I want to talk a little bit about how we do our work. I think that that's important. And then meat of what I'll share with you all today is really in the areas of housing affordability, what the data is telling us, the most updated data that we have is telling us, and where that collides with Indiana's policy landscape. I'll hit briefly on some other issues and topics that we advocate on behalf of, and then want to share with you all some tangible ways for you to stay involved in this work if you're interested. As Rachel mentioned, PI serves as the network for the state's community economic development sector. We are an organization 200 members strong, both organizational and individual practitioners, as well as just concerned Hoosiers who want to live in communities that thrive. Our members serve all 92 of Indiana's counties, and it's a pretty wide variety within our membership. About 2/3 of our membership are traditional nonprofit organizations that you all may be familiar with, such as your Habitat for Humanities, your local United Ways, community development corporations, and those doing frontline client-facing human services work. The remainder of our membership is made up of traditional financial institutions, including both banks and credit unions and CDFIs, as well as municipalities. And so the city of Indianapolis, the city of Lafayette, the city of Michigan City, the city of Fort Wayne, the city of Evansville are all members of PI. None of us do this work alone. And so I would be remiss if I didn't introduce you to the team of folks that I have the privilege of working alongside every day. They do everything from lead our public policy strategy to manage data and the data reports that we produce annually, as well as do direct training and client-facing consulting services for our members and partners. So how we work within a framework that we like to affectionately call the REAP framework, where we provide resources, education, advocacy, and programming. Very, very little programming, though. We are not a programming shop, to our membership. The resources part of that includes traditional consulting services, technical assistance, conducting trainings on best practices and emerging ideas within the community economic development sector, and making sure that we are convening our members to catapult impact. The A piece of the REAP framework is advocacy. So a lot of folks get most familiar with Prosperity Indiana through our work at the state and federal level, with advocacy, lobbying on behalf of community economic development issues. In addition to sort of the traditional advocacy and lobbying role, we do employ two full-time lobbyists on our staff. And we are proud to, produce in partnership with our national partners a couple of annual reports that I'll talk through today um, in our presentation, and we'll dive deep into both of those. The beauty of the work that we do is that housing is a center focus of it. It is a social determinant of health, and it is intersectional to every other piece of well-being of our human existence here on Earth. But we touch on a couple of other things, and so the asset building and consumer protections piece is another way that most people are familiar with our work. There has been an ongoing advocacy effort over the last decade here in the state of Indiana to stop the expansion of predatory lending practices such as payday loans, advance check cashing. That is some of the work that we have been privileged to lead alongside several partners. How we decide what we focus on when it comes to education and advocacy is that we do an annual member survey. So our members tell us directly from the field, all 200 of them serving all 92 counties, so communities big, small, far and near, about what they're seeing on the ground. And so what they tell us are these couple of bullets I'd like to share with you all today. There's a need to increase the supply, access, and habitability of affordable housing for both renters and homeowners. I will spend some time talking about that term of affordable housing, all of its stigma, what it actually means, and how people are experiencing the phenomenon of housing in Indiana. Another thing that we're hearing in relation to that is how do we act to combat the growing signs of instability? How do we slow this tide that we are seeing in the data and that people are experiencing on the ground when it comes to being able to access housing that is both stable and safe? Everybody always wants increased investments for the work. If you all have glanced at the news, I would encourage you to only glance these days. If you take a moment to glance at the news last week, you would have heard that the President of the United States issued a executive order freezing federal funding for several federally funded programs. The chaos of that executive order and it's really its uniqueness in the landscape sent a rush of anxiety and chaos and frenzy throughout the nonprofit sector last week. And so this is more important than ever. Just a quick update on that. There were lawsuits to stop that federal freeze. An injunction was issued by a federal judge. What does that mean? We still don't know. Everybody's looking to us for guidance. And what we're hearing from folks who are pulling down federal funding currently is that while some portals have opened back up, all of them have not. And so there is no clear timeline on when that money will become available. Lastly, support policies that increase wealth building. And so a part of, making sure that economic opportunity and economic mobility are available to all Hoosiers it includes things like increasing access to child tax credits, which we currently do not have a state level child tax credit here in the state of Indiana, and individual development accounts, as you know, that help folks to maximize saving for wealth building opportunities such as homeownership. And we bring our members along with us. I am of the mindset that, and our team is of the mindset that we don't empower people. People already hold their own power. It is our job to make sure that we're creating spaces and lanes and convenings in which that they can come and utilize their power for good and for impact. And so we advocate alongside our members. We allow them to tell their own stories to their elected officials and stakeholders, both at the state and federal level. All right, so this is the meat and potatoes. I will move rather quickly through these slides, but I will make sure that you all leave this presentation with access to this deck, as well as all the graphics that I will show and the data sources where we're pulling from. And so I've compiled them at the end of this into a nice clean list for you, so you'll be able to easily access. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. We are in a crisis. when it comes to the gap, and that is a pun because we've got a report called The Gap, and the gap between the need for housing that is affordable and units that are available. Here is what the data tells us at a very high level. Homeownership has decreased in the state of Indiana over the last decade, or more so since 2012, if we're looking year to year, and it's pushing more Hoosiers into the rental market. That's both the market, supply, pricing, demand. Indiana, we have one of the lowest supplies of affordable renting housing in the Midwest. And so the moniker is always Indiana is a great low cost place to be. The, the real response to that is it depends on who you are. Incomes are not keeping up with spiking rental housing costs. And the state of Indiana has refused to enforce our habitability standards, which artificially reduces the number of available units that are on the market. And so if folks can't live in a space because they're exposed to raw wiring or active mold growth, or there hasn't been heat in a unit for 2 years, or they've gone 2 years without heat, and so now the pipes are unusable, the plumbing has issues, right? That artificially affects what's available in the market. As a result of this, we are seeing eviction levels rise to pre-COVID-19 pandemic levels, and our instance of homelessness has also increased. This is a piece of data pulled from the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority's housing dashboard. It is a relatively newer data set and tool that's accessible through IHCDA, which is largely funded by the federal government. And so I need to go on and check to make sure that this is still accessible for us. But what they're showing us is that the state of Indiana has seen about 0.5% decrease in home ownership over the last decade, and 2022 is the latest data that we have for this. We've got this data broken down by county, and so you'll see Marion County listed there. Home ownership has increased in Marion County, but decreased in Hamilton and the other surrounding donut counties. What this slide does not say explicitly, but what the data tells us is that the state's 0.5% decrease in home ownership over this decade is solely driven by the loss of home ownership amongst Black Hoosiers. So it is my pleasure to introduce to some of you and reintroduce to some of you our GAP report. This is an annual report that Prosperity Indiana puts out annually in partnership with the National Low Income Housing Coalition based out of DC. And what the GAP report tells us very simply is how many affordable rental homes are available to extremely low income households in the state of Indiana and the need there. And so on average, for every 100 extremely low income households, and that is defined as houses whose incomes are at 30% of area median income or below. For every 100 of those families and households present in the state of Indiana, we have roughly 33 and a half units available for those folks. This is the second lowest rate of affordability in the Midwest. And so going back to that number, it really depends who you are in Indiana that determines how well you are living. Who makes up that sort of extremely low income housing population? And I'm really, really grateful for this large screen because we tried to cram a lot of information on this slide for you all. Those households, a third of them are in the workforce. And so there's a lot of rhetoric around sort of, well, low income people just need to go to work. They just need to get a job and, everything will make sense once they're in the workforce. A lot of these folks are in the workforce. A large set of them are also disabled or senior citizens or caretaking for those who may be disabled or senior citizens. People also ask, okay, well, if there's only one unit available for every 3 of these types of households that are present in the state, how much housing do we need to fill the gap? The answer to that is almost 140,000 units statewide. You'll see the numbers here. We've got these all broken out by county. This data can also be broken out by federal congressional district as well as state legislative district. We were very intentional about that because when you go talk to your legislators, while they care, they mostly care about their constituents. And so a part of strong advocacy is knowing your audience. And so we like to be able to bring them very customizable data when we have those conversations that reflects the communities that they are elected to serve. There's also a myth that this is largely an urban and Indianapolis problem. That is, in fact, very false. Issues of housing stability, affordability, and accessibility, we see them spread pretty equitably across the state in different types of communities, rural, urban, and suburban alike, large and small alike, homogeneous and diverse. So I'll talk a little bit about the shading that you all are seeing. So the darker the area, the fewer units that are available. And this is just another way to slice that data. Another report I'd like to introduce or reintroduce you all to, it's called the Out of Reach Report. And so this is another way where we look at how is the actual reality and the lived experience of Hoosiers on the ground measuring up to what the market is saying is the reality of our housing situation. And so what Out of Reach does, it establishes for each of the 50 states what they call a livable housing wage. For Indiana, in 2023, that number was $19 on average. And so what that means is for an individual Hoosier, it would cost in 2023 $19 to be able to comfortably rent a 2-bedroom modest unit, either a house or an apartment. That number, that wage number, that's sort of what we call the housing wage for 2024, shot up to $22.07. And so in Indiana, it takes about $22 an hour on average to be able to afford. And by afford, we mean you're spending 30% of your income or less on housing to be able to afford a modest 2-bedroom unit. Why that matters so much and why this is approaching what we consider something that is alarming is that that number increased of what the need is by $3 within a calendar year. Wages on average in Indiana increased 6 cents in that same year. So on average, the average wage in the state of Indiana increased about 6 cents between 2023 and 2024. This we also can break out by metropolitan statistical area as well as county. What the Out of Reach report also tells us is where are Hoosiers working? What are the sectors that they're working in? What are those sectors paying? And where are the mass of Hoosiers, sort of what are the top occupations for the state? This graph shows you the state's most populous sectors. So these are the workforce sectors that employ the most Hoosiers. In 2022, the number of these occupations was 9. And in those 9 occupations, folks weren't making enough to be able to afford. In 2020, our data from 2024, that number has shot up to 14. And so in 14 out of 20, so 2/3 roughly of the state's most populous occupations, on average, do not pay enough in an hourly wage for folks to be able to comfortably afford 2 bedrooms worth of housing. So we've talked a little bit about the market. We've talked a little bit about wage stagnation, and we've also talked a little bit about overall affordability. But there are additional housing accessibility issues that come along with this and that help exacerbate our overall affordability issue. I've alluded to this earlier. Every day at Prosperity Indiana, we receive phone calls or emails through our Housing for Hoosiers platform where we hear from renters in Indiana who are dealing with inhabitable housing and unsafe, unconscionable living situations. Uh, you all know the basics of economics, right? So when supply is low and demand is high, it's hard to find what you need in a way that's accessible. And so a lot of folks are toughing it out in situations that we couldn't even think of. Things like the mold that you're seeing in these photos. This is a very real photo of a unit that somebody was living in down in Madison, Indiana. If you're familiar with Southern Indiana, we get raw wiring exposure. We get, we've not had heat in 2 years. Our landlord hasn't paid the water bill. We've been paying for water in our rent, but the water bill hasn't been paid, so the water's cut off. The sidewalks have been broken for 10 years. It's not ADA compliant. These are issues that we're hearing from renters daily. You may ask how this can be. And one of the ways is because Indiana is one of only 6 states in the union that doesn't allow tenants to use rent payments to enforce habitability laws. So in the state of Indiana, we actually have written on the book some pretty strong um, laws that protect tenants and keep units safe. The problem is the localities have not been able to enforce them for one reason or the other. They've not been enforceable. 44 states now, and I think 45 now, actually, since we've put this slide together, allow something called court-based rent escrow. And what court-based rent escrow is say, for instance, you sign your lease, you sign the contract with your landlord, you're paying your rent on time, but for some reason, the landlord is not keeping up their end of the bargain. Your unit's not safe, it's not accessible, it's not stable, something is wrong. You could go to a judge and say, Judge, I'm paying my rent. I'd like to continue to keep my end of my lease, my bargain, my contract. But there are things that are of serious health and safety issue for me within my unit. The judge can say, okay, you'll begin paying your rent to the court. And once the landlord has remedied the issues, the health and safety issues, we will release the funds to your landlord. Indiana is not a state that allows that practice. There are several reasons for that. I think the largest being that this is a state that has a very large landlord advocacy coalition group association focused on making sure that our situation, particularly around housing and rental housing, is landlord favorable. Because we do not enforce our habitability standards, it does not create discounts and it depletes our housing stock. And so, one of the things we hear when we advocate for expanding affordable housing accessibility or making sure that units become more safe so that we can put more supply into the market is that well, we have plenty of things, right? There are plenty of folks who move up the economic mobility ladder. They'll vacate a unit and that'll open it up for somebody else who can afford a smaller unit or maybe a less desirable unit. That is not the case. So, outside of health and safety and habitability, one of the things that we like to bring attention to is Indiana's extremely disproportionate level of statewide evictions. The Eviction Lab put out a report a couple of years ago. Indianapolis, the city of Indianapolis, the metropolitan area, the MSI, however you'd like to categorize it, was the second largest city with the most evictions in the country behind San Francisco. South Bend was also on that list of top 20. And what we're seeing, it's not just our metros, it's everywhere in between that has a disproportionate level of eviction filings. What this data tells us very, very quickly is that almost 1 in every 10 Hoosiers who rent have dealt with eviction. So if you're a renter, college student, maybe a transient family, working class, moderate income, whatever your situation is, if you choose to rent, if you get 10 folks maybe from your apartment complex together, one person there has dealt with eviction. The other thing I'll share about when we talk about some of those other issues that lead to issues of housing accessibility and affordability is homelessness. If wages aren't increasing and your rent is, you're going to do one of two things. The first is you're going to start figuring out what trade offs you can make. And what we mean by trade offs is, am I paying for childcare this month? Am I making my car payment? Am I paying for medication? Am I able to buy food? Or am I paying my rent? That's the first thing you see. And then the second thing, unfortunately, is you see the number of homeless and unhoused populations increase. And so there have been debates at the state capitol about this, about why that number is increasing. And one line of thinking is, well, we're just getting more folks from other places moving to Indiana. And so, that's driving our number up. But what our data tells us is that the state's population has only increased about 3%, and homelessness has increased by 11%. And so those numbers just simply do not shake out. What's actually happening and what we're seeing from the data and hearing from practitioners, that people are being pushed into homelessness because there's a lack of supply of affordable and safe places to live. All right, so we are in a perfect storm when it comes to the issue of homelessness currently. And I mean, just like today, there was a hearing on a bill about homelessness. Um, and what we know works is an approach that practitioners and client facing nonprofit organizations and cities have used for the last 40 years is an approach called housing first. And simply what those practices mean is that folks have a myriad of issues, but if we can get them housed and stable, we can work on those other things. And so get them housed and then offer them encouragement and additional resources to treat things such as chronic health issues, issues of addiction and drug usage, issues of PTSD and mental health issues. Our veteran population is one that is, we've seen this work for very well, so I'll skip here. Um, there's decades and decades of research proving that this is the most effective approach to homelessness. Um, the HUD uses it, the Department of Veteran Affairs, the VA, several cities use it. There is a block of federal grants that are passed down to organizations in cities and states to do this work, but it is now under attack by people who believe that you have to earn a right to be housed. So when we say the criminalization of homelessness, and this is a phenomenon, and there are about 5 bills currently at the Indiana General Assembly that address criminalizing homelessness, this is what we mean in one way or the other. Criminalization has been defined by issuing arrest tickets, fines, and fees to folks who may be doing things like caught sleeping outside or occupying park benches over a certain amount of time. Threats of any of the above to coerce folks experiencing homelessness to leave town. Uh, Police sweeps and possession taking, particularly for people who may be living in what we refer to as homeless encampments or groups of people experiencing homelessness who are camping together in public places or outdoors generally. Um, Punishing people for doing the things that they need to survive, such as utilizing restrooms, public restrooms, bathing, those sorts of things. And we know that this is proven not to work. It actually makes homelessness worse. Why? If you can't afford housing, how am I going to afford court fees? How am I going to afford tickets? How am I going to afford fines? It also puts undue burden on our law enforcement community. How do we house within our jails and our prison systems these folks? What does that mean for resources of law enforcement who are ticketing, fining, arresting, when they could be utilizing those resources in other ways and that time in other ways? So, what are we trying to do about it? Uh, from our public policy survey, We are targeting a couple of approaches to this. The first is we are in a all out, full on, full court press. If you're familiar with basketball, um, defense against these criminalization of homelessness bills at the state level. If you are someone who is apt to speaking with the state legislator, ask them their thoughts on these bills. There's one being heard in the House next week. And so this is in real time, these things are shaking out at the Indiana General Assembly. We're trying to target development of new homes and the rehabilitation of existing properties. And the reason both of those are equally important is we simply cannot build our way out of our housing crisis or our shortage of affordable housing units. But what we do have in Indiana are entire blocks, neighborhoods, towns, areas of towns in which, there are housing stocks that can be preserved with investment. There is a state level version of Senator Todd Young's Neighborhood Home Investment Act that would do just this. Senator Young has been a strong partner of PIs at the federal level when it comes to expanding resources to increase the production of affordable housing. And so we stand with him in support of the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act as well as a state level version of this. We talked a little bit about investing in the rehabilitation and repair of our existing housing stock. It is so, so critical, you all. We are simply not going to be able to build enough housing in enough time to make up that 140,000 unit difference. Also, the other side of that, in PI, we do have members that are comprised of housing developers. It is not advantageous to developers to develop affordable housing. It costs them more to build affordable housing units than they get in their return. And so, a question that we've been trying to tackle are there public policy solutions to help address that gap to incentivize developers to focus on either rehabilitating current existing properties or building new properties that are affordable? And this is in the ways that we fight for Hoosiers who've already been squeezed out of stable housing. We talked a little bit about reducing the Scarlet E of eviction filings. There is a bill that's moving currently in the Senate, Senate Bill 142, in which we supported the original passage of that bill. We've got to look at some of the amendments that have been added, but it makes it easier for folks who have um, gone through their period with eviction or um, excuse me, paid their fees or fines for that to automatically fall off their rental history. And then we want to increase use of proven strategies, stuff that is data backed, like Housing First and housing counseling, emergency rental assistance, programs that were largely supported here at the state level through the Federal CARES Act funding that came down during the pandemic. Um, that money allowed the state of Indiana to stand up its first ever emergency rental assistance program. And so for about 5 years, folks who needed emergency rental assistance were able to receive that funding through the state. That program will sunset as all CARES Act money, and I'm sure you all know this, will do in September of this year, if not before, just given our current federal landscape. So I talked a lot about housing. We do other work as well. And a part of that work is looking at sort of Indiana's tax structure, both on the income tax side as well as the property tax side. Um, I'll go back to that moniker we hear all the time. Indiana's a low cost place to live and to do business. The caveat is it depends who you are. And so in Indiana, our lowest income residents pay the highest proportion of income in state and property taxes. So, what are we going to do about it? What we're trying to do is to create a true property tax circuit breaker. And this would prevent property tax overload on low income and senior Hoosier homeowners and renters. There are some standard models or best practice models. Michigan has one. Ohio has recently introduced a new property tax circuit breaker to try to address some of these issues. So, both red and blue states alike. Minnesota has a really strong example as well. But I think one of the things we forget when we talk about vulnerable communities is that Indiana is a state that is aging really, really rapidly. And folks want to figure out, A, how can I age in place, not just physically, right? Not being able to navigate my home or my home type, but how do I combat being on a fixed income or maybe a retirement income and seeing these property taxes continue to increase? And so those are real public policy questions that we as a state will have to grapple with sooner rather than later. And then we do work in the asset building and consumer protection side. I've mentioned some of this work to you all. Um, without better asset building opportunities, so many Hoosiers and neighbors get caught in these debt traps that are predatory loans or predatory loan products. Every year for the last 10 years at least, there has been a bill to limit the APR on payday loans in the state of Indiana to 36%. This is a part of a national effort. It's been successful in both Michigan and Illinois recently. And the reason for the 36% is that is the limit that the military branches allow for active duty members of the armed service to be able to borrow money at. They call it a issue of readiness if service members are taking money out at rates higher than 36%. Currently in Indiana, predatory payday loans or small dollar loans of up to $1,000 can be borrowed at APR of up to 391%. And then lastly, just a couple of ways for you all to get involved if you're interested or if you want to learn more. And then, as I shared earlier, just a few additional resources to share with you all. We've got 3 free statewide advocacy coalitions, basically Substacks or listservs, that I'd love to invite you all to join us. And what those are, it gives you access to we curate educational webinars once a quarter for each of the 3 coalitions. There's a newsletter that goes out every month. It's an accessible avenue to engage directly in public policy advocacy. So we do a lot of action alerts through these coalitions. And then just both networking and leadership opportunities if there's something that you're interested in. Our coalitions have grown rapidly over the last 2 years, the largest being the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. This is our advocacy coalition that functions to prioritize housing stability, affordability, tenant protections, and housing equity. A couple of our webinars include things like land information on what is a land bank, what is a community land trust, and best practice for running them. We did a whole series in 2024 on the criminalization of homelessness and created a national model toolkit that several other state partners are now utilizing. And an Indiana Housing Task Force recap. And so I'll give you an example of some of the groups who are involved in this coalition, but statewide, this coalition boasts 3,100 members and growing. So these are some of the organizations who partnered. We convene and house these coalitions, but we do it in partnership with some groups that you see listed here, particularly around the housing area. We cannot do this work alone. You all know that if you work with data, that you need people who have other types of really good data to help you back what you are trying to do. And so these are some strong partners and members of PI who partner with us in this work. The second of the 3 coalitions is our Assets and Opportunity Network. This one prioritizes financial empowerment, savings, and public benefits and programs. And so in 2022, the General Assembly passed Indiana's first ever requirement that high school students receive financial education coursework before graduation. That advocacy effort was led by the Assets and Opportunity Network. Other things they like to focus on include expanding, of course, child tax credit and reducing child poverty, as well as expanding the use of individual development accounts and investments in those matching funds. And lastly, the third group is Hoosiers for Responsible Lending. This group really is focused on stopping the expansion of predatory lending practices. And these are just a few of the data resources that I mentioned and sharing with you about our work and about, some the current landscape of housing affordability here in the state of Indiana. There are several others. If you're familiar with the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, they do really, really great reporting and data around fair housing practices here within the Indianapolis metro, and they are a proud PI member as well. And then feel free to join us. We would love to have you all and your expertise and your partnership as we think through these issues of housing affordability, accessibility, consumer protections, and asset building for low and moderate income folks. Thank you all so much for your time. And before I go, I would be remiss, and I promise Beth that there will be a survey for you all at the conclusion of today's, but I am happy to take any questions that you all have. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Hi.
Sector. And I just note what you have up there, that nursing assistants and home health aides are both on that list. And I've sat in sessions at the State House where everyone's trying to think about how can we recruit more people into these jobs.
Yeah.
But then there's a disconnect because of the wages and the
Yeah.
implications for people being able to, provide themselves and their families with a basic standard of living. So it just it's so fundamental to the very personal care that's needed, taking care of those persons. So anyway, I just thank you,
Thank you.
for your work and your
Yeah.
advocacy, and it certainly is highly relevant to a lot of the research that we do here, including mine.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Aspen, thanks again. We really appreciate it. So much information to absorb, right?
Yeah.
Um, when you mentioned earlier the different people who may report like mold or other things that are in their housing environment that cause them health issues, is that data you track, and do you have a database that people could potentially access if they were studying the lived environment and impact on people's health?
The answer to that is that we should collectively have a database through our process of reporting. And so currently how tenants who are experiencing issues of unsafeness or inhabitability, they should report to their public health department. And so, but the antidote to that is a lot of people aren't reporting due to fear of landlord retaliation, right? If I report this, I can be evicted at will, and where am I going to go? And so I think the Public Health Association or the Department of Health probably do have data that is being reported in. I'm not sure to probably the accuracy of the levels at which it's being reported.
Thank you so much, Aspen. This is great. Maybe along those same lines. I mean, I think we're a research organization, and we are trying to connect community. We're trying to work on local discovery, what we can do to impact our communities here, wanting to work with community organizations. And many of us already do work with community organizations. I'm curious if you at PI have worked with researchers in the past and what that might have looked like, or if you're interested in working with them in the future as a partner.
Yes and yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of what the ideal, what you've done in the
Sure.
past, and sort of what ideally would that partnership look like?
Yeah, just recently, this past election cycle for the gubernatorial race, we worked in partnership with IU Indianapolis Public Policy Institute to provide their housing brief and all of the data that they used for their candidate moderated conversation. I don't think they call it a debate, but we partner with the Public Policy Institute on the data and the questions for that. And we've worked with the University of Notre Dame's Poverty Center quite frequently on some things, particularly around eviction. And so, yes, and yes, we are always open. And we've got other partners too. PI is truly a convener of those who are doing the work. For those working in long-term care, ARP is a strong member of PI, and they have partnered with the state's department, FSSA, to do an Indiana aging study. I'm not sure if you know that yes, the plan on aging. We were involved in that work. We're also involved with the Public Health Association, Department of Health, some of the work that they're doing there. And so we just serve as a convener. We're not doing it all alone by any means, but yes and yes. So if there's a way that we can be helpful or connect you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And I'll make sure that everybody has access to my contact information in the follow-up. Hi.
Thanks again for your presentation. I was curious, you mentioned, my question's in relation to sort of, you were mentioning the sort of like landlord coalition and also potential public policy solutions for this idea of to develop affordable housing is not a good deal for the developers. Could you say more about like, who makes up the landlord population in the state? Because in my mind, I'm imagining there's some diversity, but I don't know what that might actually look like. Is it mostly like, is it big business, small business, these like people who, do this on the side, things like that?
It's growingly becoming large conglomerates of out-of-state investors. It's growingly becoming that. There are still what, you refer to as your mom and pops. And I think in legislation, we refer to that as landlords who own 4 properties or less. And by and large, they do great work. They provide affordable units. They work with other sources of income, such as maybe a Section 8 voucher or a veteran's benefit. We don't see the majority of issues coming from small landlords, small meaning 4 units or less. The issue starts to come in when you've got out-of-state, either hedge funds, conglomerates, investors, LLCs, who say, oh, it's cheap to buy property in Indiana. And I don't have to go through an annual inspection because the state preempts localities from requiring annual inspection. And so it's cheaper for me to do business there. I know that people need the units. And so once I buy it, I don't touch it. I don't update it. I don't go in and fix issues. They can't get me on the phone because I don't have an office in the state. Those are the types of issues when we say that there is a large conglomerate of landlords, very much bigger scale property owners as well as out-of-state investors. And that number is growing. You're welcome. The Fair Housing Center just put out a really great report on that.
So I was at a presentation not long ago, and Family Promise and some other people were there talking. And I don't, can you confirm or not that in the state legislation, right, that I want to say like over 50% of them are landlords. And so that the presenter's comment was, it's hard to change things in our state when a very large percentage of our landlords are state legislators, elected officials. Is a 50% plus like do you know?
I can't say comfortably 50%, but what I can't say is you'd be shocked at the number who are. You would be shocked at the number.
All right. Well, hearing no other questions, last chance. We'd love to just thank you so much for being here and spending time with us today. And a round of applause for Aspen. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.